All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for attending our October lecture, part of our ongoing lecture series. My name is Katie Worthing. I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center. And just have a couple of things before I introduce our speaker. First off, we'd like to thank the Leon and Lisa Gorman Fund for their support of our lecture series. Thank you also to the members who are here. Your ongoing support helps us put on programs like this, and we appreciate it. So thank you. We have a couple great in-person events coming up. One that starts on Thursday of this week is Stroll Haunted Yarmouth, which we produced with the Royal River Community Players. This is a live performance in Yarmouth's Baptist Cemetery. It's a collection of stories culled from research in our archives that have been transformed into dramatic skits performed by local actors. So tickets are selling rapidly for that. It runs Thursday, Friday, Saturday this week, and then Friday, Saturday, Sunday of next week. So do check that out. And then November 9th at 7 o'clock is the next installment of our film series, which we're offering with Merrill Memorial Library in Kenonik, which is a 16mm film archive in Portland. So these are screenings of actual films, real projector. There's nothing digital about these screenings. Our next one in November is going to be Sunset Boulevard. That's a free screening. It's open to everyone, so please come on out and enjoy a real film with us. So during the lecture, just ask that you would remain on mute so that we have great audio quality for everyone. We will have some time at the end for questions, so save your questions then. If one pops into your head during the talk, you're also welcome to use the chat box to write that question. Now for tonight's speaker, we're pleased to welcome Rebecca White here tonight. Rebecca is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Maine at Augusta. She received her PhD from the University of Maine History Department in 2015 and her MA in European History from the University of Pittsburgh in 2002. She specializes in women's history and gender studies. Welcome, Rebecca. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of your busy evenings to come and join and learn a little bit more about women's history here in Maine. So good to be with you all. So I'm going to start off with a little question for our small group. We're a smaller group, so you'll get put on the spot here. See some responses. But I'm going to be doing this talk on women's clubs in Maine, and specifically on the idea of maternalism as an idea. And I wondered, just from that name, and maybe just from this image that you have in front of you, do you have any guesses of what you think maternalism might be? Probably be easier if I had put the actual title out there so you could see the word. So maternal, like, you know, woman, a maternal mother, maternalism. Any ideas or guesses? Feel free, jump right in. Katie might have a guess.
Well, I would say, you know, maternalism, focusing on nurturing, caring for other people, places, settings, things like that.
Exactly. So in the 19th century, of course, women did not have the right to vote. They won't earn the right or gain the right to vote until 1920. But they had a lot of political power and political influence in other ways. And something that I've been interested in my own research into Maine women's history is how maternalism kind of worked as a concept in Maine politics and Maine history. So what I mean by that is maternalism is this idea, as Katie very rightly said, that that women, and this was very common in the 19th century, building on older ideas, but the idea was that women were just inherently more attuned to things like children and domestic work. So that meant that they had expertise in this area. And for some women, they use that idea, the idea that women were somehow inherently more pious, that they were more moral than men. And they used that idea and sort of capitalized on it to try to gain some political power. Okay, so in areas that were specifically considered to be covered as part of women's maternal realm. That could be a lot of things. That could be things like schools, that could be various forms of higher education. It could be welfare programs, it could be charities, it could be anything having to do with the care of women and children, anything in the realm of teaching, nursing, all those sort of classical like maternal professions. So the cool thing about maternalism in Maine is that on the one hand, it's sort of limiting because it was very much seeing women as like being defined as being mothers. But on the other hand, it gave a way for these women in the 19th century, way before they had the right to vote, to assert power for themselves, to say, you know, as a woman, I myself, it is my job to try to care for the community. And to do that, I need to insert myself into politics, right? In a variety of ways. So that had a lot of ramifications. So my goal for this evening is to give you like an overview, just some highlight samples of some women's clubs in Maine from the late 19th and into early 20th century. I picked out 5 different ones to give you a little sampling of the vast diversity of women's clubs in Maine in this time, what they were doing, what they were trying to accomplish, and the really varied types of women who were involved in these women's clubs. So they range all over the place from things like interest in establishing playgrounds to establishing safer women's prisons, to creating something called mother's allowances, which were payments paid by the state to widows, specifically so that they would not lose their children to orphanages at the turn of the century. So before, you know, Social Security and those sorts of things. Wide varieties of areas. We could advance the slide. So this gives a different sense of maternalism here. So this is an image entitled, you know, Sacred Motherhood from 1908 with the S obviously as the symbol of money. This is showing a very different idea of mothers and how they are treated in the US at this time, right? So unlike the previous sort of idealized version of like this beautiful, probably wealthy woman at home, this is the reality for most women, right? They are working, they are taking care of children. This particular image shows a woman breastfeeding while working a sewing machine, probably doing piecework at home for money. Children in the background, probably not great circumstances, right? And so this is another aspect of maternalism. So many middle class and upper middle class women's groups were concerned about the problems of poverty and specifically issues around infant mortality that they saw as directly related to sort of failures of the state to take care of women properly. And so they also began to organize around things like milk clubs or creating safer working conditions for women, protective legislation, all sorts of different things. Okay, so if you want to advance. So, and then for some women, and I'll just mention them briefly, for the suffragists, those who wanted specifically to gain women the right to vote, something that had been a process that had been going on for more than 100 years, they saw maternalism as a way of really improving society. So because they had this idea that women were inherently biologically like more nurturing than men, that they were more moral than men, that if only women got the vote, right? As you can kind of see here in this very hopeful image, right? If only women would get the vote, then the ills of society could be improved. So on the left, I know it's a little hard to see in this, but on the left, there's like public drunkenness and people being thrown in the police station and sort of essentially the fires of hell are opening up, right? And on the right, once we have women voting, we're going to have things like clean streets and public playgrounds and free libraries and equal and better society for everyone. Okay, so they're sort of promoting these ideas as well, that women are going to literally come in and conduct what was referred to, historians refer to as civic housekeeping. The idea that women would come in, they would see all this corruption, and they could literally like take their brooms of maternalist common sense and sweep it out the door. Did that happen? Definitely not, right? But that was the idea. That was the idea here. Okay, if you want to advance. Okay, so this has to do with suffrage. So we'll leave that on, and I'm going to sort of turn to my notes here. So there were both suffrage and anti-suffrage women's organizations in Maine. Some people don't realize that they were pretty strong, not as strong as the suffrage group, but quite substantial numbers of women who also joined in the anti-suffrage women's organizations. So I'm taking Women's Club here kind of broadly to mean organizations that a lot of women joined, and they were so varied. All right, so let me pull up my notes here. Okay, so in Maine, as in most other parts of the country, so starting here in kind of the late 19th, early 20th century in the progressive era, there were private and religious charities and ladies' aid societies as far as the eye could see. They're literally in every town, incredibly popular. Many scholars have documented the way in Maine in particular, there was a very strong temperance movement that was dominated by women, and the way that what was known as the Maine Law of Prohibition served as an example to the rest of the country. Also, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was highly popular in Maine, had large numbers of women members. And it's clear from a variety of sources that a significant number of middle-class Maine women in the mid-19th into the early 20th century were contributing actively in all kinds of social organizations, in fundraising, in sophisticated political lobbying to try to achieve particular reform goals, many of them with a maternalist goal. Moreover, many of those temperance supporters, which included a long line of Maine Republican legislators and governors as well, often supported a wide range of progressive social causes. So they worked year-round and nonstop, it seemed, if you analyze their club records, in building their successful campaigns. They worked to build and staff playgrounds, improve school buildings, provide hot lunch programs and free milk stations, and to otherwise engage in their communities. So it's clear from many sources that Maine women, the term was club women, Maine club women were a very potent political force, way before this issue of suffrage even comes on the table. They are organized and doing work all across Maine throughout urban and rural areas. But it's probably not surprising to know that much of the activity is concentrated in areas with higher populations, right? So in more urban settings, because you have a greater density of wealth and a greater density of middle and upper class women who could form these clubs, foster networks with each other. And many of them turn their eyes in this period to working on various charitable programs to aid the poor, to aid the needy. These women were unpaid, but they created very professional organizations, of which these two are just two examples. They created and staffed them. They considered themselves to be well qualified, efficient, businesslike in their endeavors. And indeed, from this sort of class of women, we see the result of the sort of late 19th century increase in middle class women attending college. So they have already professionalized, They've distinguished themselves by their education and their credentials. And you can really see that when you look at these records of these women's clubs. There's a strong focus on sort of order and being businesslike and being professional. So there's a couple of examples of that. The Portland Associated Charities, for example, established by a group of women in 1879 to gather information about the city's charitable needs and coordinate what they called a more scientific approach to charity. And they used their resources to canvass for needs and to establish really useful things like a public laundry, a day nursery, recreation playgrounds for children, and continuing education classes for both sexes. These women really got stuff done. Okay, so in terms of suffrage, women were active on, as I said, on both sort of areas of that. Let me scroll down here a little bit if you want to advance the slide. So the Maine Woman Suffrage Association was established in Augusta in 1873. More than 1,000 people, men and women, attended this organization. And this group, this is one of their most important leaders here, Florence Brooks Whitehouse. Isn't this a cool image? So she, this is an image I found in the archives at the Maine Historical Society. And it was a book called Mother Goose Comes to Portland. And it sort of had a collection of all these sort of leading progressive people in Portland and turned them into caricatures based on Mother Goose rhymes. Strange, I know, but they sold this as sort of like a fundraising thing. So Florence Brooks Whitehouse shows up in this. As you see here, she is chairman of the Maine National Women's Party. And her husband, actually, Robert Whitehouse, was amongst many jobs he was chair of the men's version of the suffrage organization. So see her sort of caricatured, but I think kind of nicely caricatured here. It doesn't seem very nasty at all. Okay, so there were many others, but she was sort of one of the most vocal. So by the turn of the 20th century, Maine suffragists really were submitting petitions for suffrage repeatedly, over and over and over again, almost every year. They were repeatedly defeated through strong opposition, both in the community and in the legislature. So, for example, in 1872, the Maine legislature rejected a bill that was put forth for women's suffrage. And they continue to do so almost every year, as well as other suffrage related bills, like those limiting women's right to vote in municipal elections. Early suffragists in Maine, like Florence Brooks Whitehouse, had to kind of find solid arguments to convince their neighbors that votes for women wouldn't just benefit women, but that they would benefit everyone. And so they put together things like postcards and other sorts of propaganda to illustrate, again, these maternalist ideas that women were the experts. Women were experts on food, women are experts on children and household management, and therefore they really were the most qualified people to be voting on these important policy sort of decisions. This is Florence Brooks Whitehouse of Portland. She was a frequent speaker on behalf of suffrage in Maine and received a lot of scathing commentary by other women in Maine, that she was too radical, that she was unwomanly, basically, for her protests. There were at least 2,000 women members of the anti-suffrage movement. So we must remember that they also were a women's club, right? Who undoubtedly had very strong ideals and beliefs as well. Okay, let's see. If you want to advance to the next one. Okay, so I also wanted to mention, and just for time, I've cut them out. I'm sorry to business and professional women's clubs. There are so many different clubs to talk about, but I just wanted to at least get a picture in here. There's a long-standing history of these business and professional women's club associations in Maine. And they, you can find in various archives, they had these wonderful collections. I've looked at some of them of, what do you call those? Scrapbooks of their newspaper clippings, and they would have yearly conferences that they would attend, complete with various sort of ceremonial luggage tags, and they would march in parades every year dressed in various costumes. So this was really a women's club for women, many of whom, not exclusively, but many of whom were single women, so unmarried women, who used this club as a place to network with other women in a time when that was very difficult to do. And also to find sort of companionship with each other amongst this small group of women who were involved as accountants and bookkeepers and lawyers and other sort of professional kind of fields. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So totally different kind of club here. So as part of my research into my dissertation, that's where some of this information is coming from. There's all these odds and ends you find when you're spending lots of time in archives. And I came across in my research, there was a state organization called the Maine Federation of Women's Clubs. And they had more than 30 different affiliated members. This is like a highly organized thing. And when I was looking through their materials, I found reference to a group of women from Indian Island near Old Town in Maine that were sometimes called the Wabanaki Women's Club, sometimes called the Indian Island Women's Club, established in 1897 and shortly thereafter affiliated with the Maine Federation of Women's Club. So you may think to yourself, well, that seems normal, right? That seems like a common thing to do, but it actually wasn't at all. It was sort of caused a stir that the Maine Federation of Women's Clubs would even allow this Wabanaki Club to become full members, which they do. They pay their dues every year and join the federal or the national board as well of women's clubs, and are active. As far as I can tell, they are active until one of the leading members dies and they withdraw their membership in 1952. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about that. Let me go back into my notes here. Okay, so this club was started by a Mrs. Martha Nicolar, who was the wife of a prominent Penobscot man named Horace Nicolar. She organized this club in 1897 and then petitioned to be allowed to join, which they were. They began in 1897 with 13 members. And they said that their goal was to, quote, collect and preserve all traditions and legends of its tribe. Perhaps not surprisingly, the creation of this club was treated as a sort of newspaper oddity. So actually in doing newspaper searches, I found mention of this Wabanaki Club, at least in small blurbs, usually in a very unflattering way in places as far away as Indiana, for example, talking about how strange it was that there could be this group and referring to them in various unflattering ways. So they were treated as, one could kindly say, a curiosity in the newspaper accounts. But we do know that Mrs. Nicolar attended at least one of the statewide conferences with a specific purpose. So her goal was to advocate for better educational resources on Indian Island, specifically an industrial school, which could be teaching trades. According to the Maine Federation records, she was warmly received. The club was also got a mention in the National PTA magazine, which was Child Welfare magazine. As part of that, she was sort of welcomed and introduced, and it said that she briefly addressed the Federation, both in her own language and in English. Here. So pictured here is her daughter, actually. So the club continues on, but is sort of reinvigorated when her daughter, Mrs. Florence Nicolar Shea, takes over the club in 1931. So okay, well, I'll come back to that. So she takes on a much more sort of overtly political position. Mrs. Shea was the first Penobscot woman to graduate from Old Town High School. She also was a nationally renowned mezzo-soprano. She had records published by Victrola, and she toured the country under the name Princess Wadawaso. And as part of her travels, she met and married her husband, pictured there on the right. This photo is circa 1940 or so. It was undated in the scrapbook, but I think that it's around 1940. Her husband, Bruce Pulau, who was from the Kiowa tribe in Oklahoma, and they traveled all around the country together performing in Wild West shows. But at the time of the Great Depression, they came back to Maine, came back to Indian Island, and she opens a store. She had various business things going on. And as part of that, she also reinvigorated the Wabanaki Club. It seems clear that what she was doing was trying to use this women's club format, which is ostensibly not really very political, to try to affiliate her organization and the needs of her community with these, respectable, semi-prestigious Anglo-American women's clubs. So trying to sort of harness the idea of gendered middle-class values to try to get their support for her goals, which at that time were still, in the 1940s, achieving the rights of Native Americans to vote, because that's not achieved until 1967, and also continuing to work on the educational rights for Penobscot people in general. Okay, so if you could advance the slide, switch to an entirely different club here. So what do you see here?
I'm seeing everyone's face react. I think everyone sees this. Everyone's on mute, but I think we see the emblem.
Yes. So it's not pretty, right? But history often isn't. Often is not pretty. So in addition to these, so my point in including this is to show the really different ways, wildly different people, right? We're utilizing this concept of the women's club or women's activism. So on the one hand, you have women like Mrs. Nicolar Shea advocating for like Native American voting rights. And at the same time, you have women who are actively joining the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan, which was pretty active in Maine, in many communities around Maine. The history of the women's Ku Klux Klan is less well documented, and it's not something I've personally done research on, but this is, I put a little blurb there at the bottom. This is drawn from someone else's work. This is Dr. Maureen Elgersman Lee. So she, at the time that she published this, was a historian at USM, working on African American history. So she documented the presence, at least, of these women's Klan organizations. So as you may or may not know, the Klan had a resurgence in the 1920s in Maine, as well as many other parts of the country. And a few years after that, the Women's Ku Klux Klan organization grew very quickly. So by the mid-20s, they had about 125,000 members nationally, not in Maine, good Lord, but nationally. According to them, their numbers reached even higher, that they were closer to 500,000 members. And they did have chapters in at least 36 different states, including Maine. So the biggest states where they were active were in Indiana and Ohio. But they were active in Maine as well. So the seal that you can see here, so this one is for, see, which one did I put up? The Augusta Klan. There are also at least 2 more of these seals still in existence. You can see them through the Maine Historical Society in Portland. There was an Augusta Klan, the Augusta Klan number 11, and the Klan number 15, which was in Bath. And these were big, weighty seals. They weighed about 3 pounds each, and were pretty big. So the imprint itself has a diameter of almost 2 inches. So these are big seals, and they copy the formula of the WKKK's national headquarters, showing a woman with a sword and a shield, and the other with the cross and the letters. So it's very little has survived. I have tried to do some research. The little bit I could find really just corroborated what this previous historian work had already done. Very basic information remains, like that they paid a $10 a year membership fee to be a part of it. We do know also that women marched in some of the Klan parades in Portland and I believe in Dexter, probably in other places, but they're sort of captured in the photos there. And there were visible in Portland in a women's auxiliary group called of all things, called the Klaxima, Klaxima, which seems to have been sort of comparable to the WKKK. All right, I hope we're all suitably mortified. We can go on to the next one. Okay, so this next one, just all over the place with my women's clubs, but I think that is kind of also part of the point, to show just how diverse these groups really were, for good and for bad, right? So the final part of what I want to talk to you about, and I know I'm just skimming along the surface here, but the final part I want to talk to you about is a group that I have spent a fair amount of time researching, and they are called the Mrs. Maine Club. Mrs. Maine Club. And this was an organization that I happened to stumble across as I was doing research about women's activism at the University of Maine at Orono. And this was a group that was established basically by the wives of male students as a way of sort of supporting each other. So now we're kind of full circle, right, in a way, back to maternalism still being important, right? So I want to talk a little bit about them. I find them to be a very compelling group in terms of what they were able to accomplish. So basically, I was, through much historical research, as you may or may not know, involves just sitting and reading files, many of which are very, very boring. But occasionally you'll find that intriguing one that really catches your eye. So I was looking through these files for the Office of the President, and I came across a file labeled Veterans Child Welfare Clinic. And through that, I was able to start digging out information about this really vibrant community organization that flourished on campus from the late 1940s into the 1970s. They called themselves various names. They started out with the name the GI Wives Club, and they later became the Mrs. Maine Club. And this is a group of student wives who sort of banded together, and they started a cooperative daycare center on campus, a children's health clinic, both of which were really successful and long-lasting. So they accomplished remarkable things, this sort of scrappy group of women, this club of women. The rest of what you'll see here is some images from my research that I took from the University of Maine archives. Some of them are from college yearbooks, and some of them are newspaper articles. So I use these to kind of demonstrate, I hope, the ways they use their status as wives of veterans and as mothers to push the University of Maine to support their agenda, to support the things that they wanted to have happen. It began as just this organization for student wives. It evolved by the 1950s into a really popular campus club. So instead of being on the outskirts of campus, it sort of moves in. It was regularly featured in the yearbook, and it was open to all married women students or wives of students. So it's really inclusive in that way. So I think the Mrs. Maine Club also provides insight into much needed services that were provided by these women, as well as by the university's cooperative extension and home economic departments. Let me see what photo we have up here. Okay, so the first image you see here is from the Maine alumnus from May 1946, and it's demonstrating a series of prefab barracks that were moved to Orono to help to house this new population. And you can move on to the next photo there so you can see some photos of the interior, what these look like. These are not the exact same barracks, but they give you a sense of what these little cabins looked like, okay? And why they might be there. So you can sort of start looking at those. Okay, so why are all these families moving onto campus? You might be able to guess. It's because of the GI Bill. So after World War I, right, soldiers return home, and there is a really sharp increase in the number of veterans who are entering into college and universities all across the country. So at the University of Maine, the enrollments right after World War I essentially double the pre-war numbers. So in 1946, for example, 3,200 students enrolled. This is twice the pre-war numbers. Of those, 1,971 are veterans. So a large proportion of the students are male veterans who enroll. And of those, more than 550 were married, often with one or more children. So what are they going to do, right? There's this pressing need for family housing. So the university contracted with the US government, and they relocated 23 temporary housing barracks from the South Portland Navy Yard to campus. So that's kind of what you saw in those photos. And beginning in 1946, approximately 196 veterans families came to the University of Maine, and they moved into these 3- and 4-bedroom apartments. And then they would be followed by an additional 100 families who moved into a really motley collection of trailers and random sort of cabins nearby. These buildings were meant to be only temporary, and they were regarded as subpar, sort of in the extreme. The places where these cottages were located on campus was nicknamed Splinterville, as well as Fertile Valley, to give you some sense. So these were rough barracks. Officially, they were named the South Apartments, and they immediately began to fill to capacity with young families. An additional 600 more married GI students remained on the waiting list. So this was in hot demand. Though of poor construction and heated only by very temperamental oil stoves, often surrounded by mud, they were partially furnished and they were available at a really low rent. So that's a big incentive for the veterans family who had very few rental options. And I found an interview with someone, an alumni who grew up, or at least was a child, in one of these apartments. Excuse me, thinking of a different example. So this person, Gerard Collum, he was actually one of the veterans themselves, excuse me. So his experience was, he said, for the first 9 months, we lived in one of the single-story buildings that were collectively known as Pregnant Valley. They consisted of about 10 apartments in a row, back to back, which had to be evacuated now and then when a fire alarm went off accidentally, or when someone's dinner went up in smoke while cooking on a hot plate equipped with a collapsible oven for a stew or some other fare. So to get this housing, he commented, when we were sure we were comfortably pregnant and with a certificate of pregnancy from the obstetrician in hand, we could present this to the major who was in charge of university housing. He was a, quote, savvy old stickler who carefully scrutinized all the documents and applications to verify their authenticity, and then they got approved to move into one of these 8 apartment barracks. I found another example of Francis Harden, who was a high school teacher and later became a university librarian. He moved in, she moved into South Apartments in 1946 with her art professor husband and their 2 young children. And in her memoir, which was called A Maine Passage, she also talked about these barracks. So she established that they had very thin walls, they had no insulation, they had a very unreliable coal stove. She said, quote, it was so cold that the boys played in their snowsuits, even indoors. And this constant cold is also mentioned in the memoir of Dr. A. Dewey Richards, a resident of South Apartments with his wife and young children in the 50s. He talked about the coal fires again and how they often went out and how they were very hard to relight. And he recalled his wife having to go out and cut down small trees from the university forest, which she would then dip in kerosene in order to relight the stoves. So this is all to give you a sense of sort of what these women are walking into, the difficulties they were facing. And you can go ahead and advance the slide again. Here, so you see an aerial view in 1947. You can see some of the cottages, the sort of barrack layout in the back there. And then when you're ready, you can advance it again. They're just more images of the same sort of thing. Oh, this is a wonderful. So as part of the alumni magazine also, they published this article, Meet the Veteran at Home. It has these very cheerful photos of these families living in the dorms. Okay, so the GI, I'm getting now to the reason for the Mrs. Maine Club. So the GI Bill provided tuition, books, and supplies for these returning veterans, but they only gave an allowance of $90 a month, regardless of how many dependents that veteran had. So because of this, many of the wives, they couldn't make it work. So many of the wives of these veterans found full and part-time jobs on campus. And despite, or maybe because of all of these adversities, a tight community grew up amongst these families as they really struggled to make a home in these conditions with very little income. They formed what they called the Gay 90s for the $90 a month they got, a social club to work together to meet budgeting and childcare needs. And it seems that the concept of children around campus came to be seen as somewhat normal. So you can see in this Maine alumnus article, Meet the Veteran at Home. There's a parade of wives and baby carriages coming across campus to meet dad. This is all kind of romanticized, but after a long, hard day in the classroom. And they're arguing this has become an accepted feature of college life. And the article stresses these tidy apartments and happy families and the, quote, cheerful acceptance of difficulties by the young families. Be that as it may, many of the residents, the women in particular, decided to band together to try to have some cooperative action to improve their conditions. So in 1946, a group of 11 wives initiated a survey of all the families that were living in the South apartments, the trailers, and the cabins on campus. And what they discovered was that there were more than 150 children living on the University of Maine campus with no childcare facilities whatsoever. So this led them to a petition in December of 1946 that went to the Veterans Administration, the Health Department, local health nurses, a whole bunch of people on campus for help. And while all of those groups sent back letters saying they expressed interest and support, none of them actually stepped forward to do anything. So in response, the GI wives organized themselves into a child health council and decided they would do it themselves. So in February of 1947, they organized the first of many child health clinics with a doctor and a public health nurse and 7 veterans' wives assisting. They also convinced the president of Orono, President Hawk, to fund this to the grand total of $500. And that sum also covered the hiring of one of the GI wives, a Mrs. Jean Turner, to act as a part-time public health nurse. By November of 1947, the president was then persuaded to contribute an additional $200 to fund a series of child health clinics, including doctor, nurse, and immunization supplies. So how did they pay for all this? The women's group, the GI Ladies Club or GI Wives Club, organized benefit dances that they called the Baby Ball, and that helped to raise additional funds. In addition, a Mrs. Doris Ladd, who is an extension agent provided through the Department of Agriculture, came in and helped them organize health, nutrition, and sewing classes. At the same time, let's see, where are we with our, okay, so you can go ahead and advance it if you want. Okay, so this is a reenactment for the photo for 1948, reenactment of this meeting with President Hawk in 1946 by leaders of this women's group to try to, get some funds from him. I think you can go forward. This is an image, I believe I took from the yearbook of their child health clinic in 1948. Okay, so even President Hawk himself acknowledged, however, that the services that were being provided for families were still, quote, rather meager. So he indicated that he might be opening to assisting with a university daycare. And they indicated that 20 to 30 children were already being informally taken care of in various veterans' homes, but that did not come anywhere close to serving the more than 140 children who were living on campus. So Maine Day volunteers in 1947 constructed a new playground on campus, but the next big achievement was the establishment of the Maine Cub Nursery School in January 1949 with 21 young students. And I think I have some cute photos of them. If you go forward, so more from the baby health clinic. Oh, this is the Mrs. Harlan Ladd that I mentioned standing there in the suit. She's the lady from Cooperative Extension who worked with them to set up various home economics programs. You can go forward. Here's the new playground being built on campus for the children. Okay, and then I thought this was very dear. This is the invoice that they submitted to the university, their 1949 invoice for the list of toys and books for the Maine Cub Nursery School, coming to a grand total of $28.81. And if you go forward, just more images of the families living in the apartments here. So they start the nursery school in 1949 with 21 students, and they run it entirely, they fund it and run it entirely themselves. So basically the university just provides the room, and they created a subcommittee of the Mrs. Maine Club that would organize it, clean it, do practically everything. It was open every weekday morning for student children. It cost $5 a month. And the school was able on that, because of all the volunteers, able to employ a teacher, an assistant, and a visiting nurse. Everything was completely self-supporting. And this was really vital because in July of 1949, the university stopped providing any funds to help them. So they had to carry it all on without any help. And they did that without any paid staff. The Maine Cub Nursery School remained in operation until 1964, when it actually finally closed because of declining enrollments. There just weren't as many student families being enrolled. And then at this point, my knowledge about what the Mrs. Maine Club was doing starts to really tail off. The most I was able to find, they're still in operation, but the records don't remain. What I was able to find is that they continue to exist mainly through their presence in the yearbook. The well baby clinics continued to exist through the 1950s. That you can see that in financial receipts to the university. In 1947, for example, the Child Health Clinic oversaw polio vaccinations for 172 children. But they still continued to serve student children well into the 70s. So we can see that this was a really effective all volunteer women's club. It's interesting because in their correspondence, the club presidents would often joke that they were just there to kind of get there what they saw. There's a little 1950s humor, but that they were there to get their PHT, meaning put husband through. But that they also were there to help themselves. In 1969, the club president, Mrs. James Day, stated that this club is a problem-solving club for wives, and that they worked hard to try to address the financial pressures in their lives, and that they had all these wonderful social outlets and sewing and canning and group Christmas parties. As Mrs. Day noted, it's, quote, an evening away from being quiet, from creeping around the house while your husband is studying. So the remainder of the images there are just the yearbook photos of the group. They continue to stay concentrated in those old barracks apartments. Remember, I said they were meant to be temporary. They were supposed to be used for a maximum of 5 years, but surprise, they're still in full use in the 1960s. The president in 1961 announced they would be torn down, and the residents were able to successfully protest to try to keep those barracks, even though the rents were actually doubled. And when I looked at the file that included the petitions, I saw that 96 of the senators of the signatures were from those South apartment residents, many of those same women who had joined the Mrs. Maine Club or had encouraged its continuance from the very beginning. Okay, I could go on and on, but I see that my time has run out, so I will stop talking. These are groups that I feel really passionate about, and I think that I love this photo here of the young graduates, isn't that dear? That this is a group who really kind of provides some insight into all of the work that these women and other women like them have done to try to improve the lives of themselves and their communities, often for no money and for very little recognition. Okay, I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I think I'll open it up to questions if people have thoughts. I had one as you were talking. It was really easy as you were talking about maternalism and this need to sort of clean up public spaces or create parks. You know, Yarmouth's Village Improvement Society really fits into that mode in the early 20th century. And one of the presidents of the VIS was Harriet Byrd, who was a prominent anti-suffragist. So I was thinking about, yeah, we have her scrapbook. If you ever want to see it, it's really fascinating. All of her essays and speeches are in it. But I've always been fascinated by the way she was able to sort of leverage her own political power and network to argue sort of against the expansion of it for others. So that's kind of question or thought A. And then thought B is, what did these women do after suffrage became a thing? You know, did they pick up another cause? Do you have a sense for what was their next fight, or did they just sort of stop?
That is a wonderful question. So to take that second part first, there is no doubt, it certainly appears that the sort of maternalist-based women's activism that you see before the vote kind of disappears after suffrage. So it's like after the goal was achieved, that legislative goal, women tended to disperse in many, many different directions. So they no longer had the one thing to sort of unite them. And of course, as I tried to highlight, like they're so different from each other and have such different goals that there wasn't as much to hold them together once suffrage had been achieved. Also, sort of corresponding to that same time period, a lot of the social welfare focus that so many of those early clubs had after the 1920s or so is starting to increasingly become professionalized. So they are no longer able to say, well, I'm a woman, therefore I know about it, kind of a thing. Instead, those organizations are increasingly turning to social workers, many of whom are also women, but a different sort of educated woman, and away from them being involved in more overt political action. So a lot of these women's clubs become a lot less political after suffrage is achieved. One group that I didn't talk about at all was the PTA. So the PTA was very much a women's, it started out as the National Congress of Mothers. So very maternalist. And then they changed their name. But the head of the PTA in Maine was a lady in Augusta, and she helped to push through mother's allowance legislation, which was like a very early form of welfare. I think I mentioned right at the very beginning, but then decided to cruise past just for time. So yeah, so a lot of that sort of political kind of fervor fizzles, I would say. I can't remember what the first question was. Oh, the anti-suffragists. Yes, they are so fascinating. And there's a long history of them. I'm thinking of, for example, from the revolutionary or post-revolutionary era, it's someone like a Catherine Beecher, who was a strong advocate for women to go into higher education. She was part of that Beecher, you know, she's related to Harriet Beecher Stowe, that's like incredibly well-educated abolitionist family. And she herself helped to found the Hartford Female Seminary, also an anti-suffragist. Why? It's still kind of mysterious to me, but part of it, again, I guess, goes back to that double-edged sword of maternalism, is that they felt that by entering into politics, they would kind of sacrifice their special place or whatever as women, which never really existed. So, or only existed for very wealthy, privileged women, right? Most women are not, that's not how they're living. That's not how they're experiencing that. So, yeah, it has always been fascinating to me. When I teach that, the students are always surprised at how many women were anti-suffragists. They think it'd be like, oh yeah, men wouldn't want that. It's like, well, there actually were men who were supporting suffrage, and there were some women who are against suffrage. So it's more complicated than that. People are strange.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a mind-blowing thing when I mention it to students, and we've had interns who have wrestled with it too, the sort of anti-suffrage woman and how she wields her power.
Well, I mean, that also kind of relates to the women's Ku Klux Klan in a way. Not that I'm saying they are the same thing. They are not the same thing at all. But, you know, women are can be just as horrible, you know, as men, and their organizations reflect that. So I guess it's not a surprise that women would also be anti-suffragists. Women would join the Klan. Women would be involved in all sorts of things that do not reflect well, right, on our sort of current moment.
Any other questions from the folks attending? All right, I'm seeing head shaking, so I think we'll close there. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for this talk.
You're
We will have
welcome.
it available on our website, but thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for coming. And thanks for being such a good audience. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.